In the fall of 1882, Hollow Creek, Kentucky, was a place that seemed untouched by the troubles of the wider world. Nestled between rolling hills and thick woodlands, it was a town where the church bell marked the rhythm of life, where neighbors shared bread and sorrow in equal measure. To an outsider, Hollow Creek looked idyllic, children chasing fireflies in twilight fields, families gathering on porches, and hard-working farmers tending their crops. But beneath that surface lay currents of jealousy, pride, and long-simmering resentment. At the center of it all stood the Blackwood family. Their sprawling farmhouse on the edge of town was a landmark, a symbol of both prosperity and power. They were admired for their wealth, envied for their influence, and, though no one dared admit it aloud, resented by more than a few. Hollow Creek was a community of smiles and handshakes, but in hushed conversations behind closed doors, the name Blackwood stirred emotions that were anything but neighborly. No one could have guessed that before the year ended, the family's name would forever be written in blood. Thomas Blackwood was a man carved from hard work and ambition. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with a voice that carried authority, he had built his family's fortune on farmland and timber. His wife, Eleanor, was his softer opposite, gentle, graceful, and often seen giving bread to the poor or tending to the sick. Together they raised 5 children: Catherine, the eldest daughter with her mother's kindness; William, strong-willed like his father; young twins, Samuel and Sarah, who filled the farmhouse with laughter; and baby Emily, barely 3 years old, whose curls shone golden in the sunlight. The Blackwoods were seen as the first family of Hollow Creek. They donated money to build the schoolhouse, hosted harvest gatherings, and kept their workers fed through the harsh winters. Yet whispers followed them. Some claimed Thomas had acquired land through intimidation. Others insisted he had crushed struggling farmers under debts they could never repay. To his face, townsfolk nodded respectfully, but behind him they spoke of the Blackwoods as both benefactors and oppressors, a family that inspired gratitude and bitterness in equal measure. Hollow Creek was not a large town, but it was deeply divided. On one side were families who saw the Blackwoods as protectors, people who had built schools, employed dozens, and ensured prosperity trickled down. On the other side were families who whispered of injustice. Land that once belonged to humble farmers now stretched beneath the Blackwoods' fences. Rumors told of contracts signed under duress, of debts bought and sold until families had no choice but to leave their land. At Sunday service, both sides sat under the same roof, their voices joining in hymns of forgiveness, but their hearts carried grudges. The Blackwoods, proud and dignified in their pew at the front, embodied wealth that many felt they would never touch. And though no one dared speak it aloud, there were those who believed the Blackwoods' downfall was not just inevitable, it was deserved. It was a dangerous sentiment, festering in silence, a silence that would soon be broken in the most violent of ways. The evening of October 17th arrived with dark clouds rolling across the hills. A storm, fierce and wild, swept through Hollow Creek. Lightning split the sky as rain battered the Blackwood farmhouse. Inside, the family gathered as they always did. Thomas sat by the fire reading scripture by candlelight. Eleanor hummed softly as her needle threaded through fabric. Upstairs, Catherine read to her younger siblings while little Emily drifted into dreams. The storm seemed ordinary, but outside the Blackwood estate a figure lingered. Hidden among the trees, a lantern flickered briefly before being snuffed out. The watcher's breath came heavy, mingling with the roar of thunder. Whether driven by hatred, envy, or vengeance, the decision had already been made. That night would mark the end of Hollow Creek's most powerful family. The storm raged, but within the farmhouse, the Blackwoods remained unaware that darkness greater than thunderclouds was descending upon them. It began with a single deafening crack. A gunshot pierced the storm, shattering the fragile peace inside the farmhouse. Thomas fell instantly, his book tumbling into the fire. Eleanor's scream cut through the night as the candle toppled, sending shadows leaping across the walls. Boots pounded against wooden floors. The children, startled awake, rushed from their beds, their cries drowned by the sound of thunder and gunfire. Catherine tried to shield her siblings, but terror gripped them all. The intruder, no, intruders, moved with terrifying purpose. They were not there for robbery. Nothing was stolen. They were there for blood. What unfolded in that hour was horror Hollow Creek had never seen. The screams of the Blackwoods echoed against the storm until silence swallowed the house whole. When the rain ceased, only darkness remained, darkness and death. Dawn revealed the horror. Smoke curled above the Blackwood farmhouse, mingling with mist that clung to the hills. Neighbors, alerted by the strange stillness, approached cautiously. What they found inside froze their hearts. Thomas, Eleanor, and their children, all lifeless, furniture overturned, walls stained with blood, and the once warm home, now a tomb. Word spread through Hollow Creek like wildfire. By mid-morning, the entire town stood outside the farmhouse, staring at the carnage with disbelief. Mothers clutched their children closer. Men whispered of vengeance, while others trembled with fear. But one fact became undeniable. The Blackwoods had not fallen to strangers. No valuables were taken, no signs of theft. This was not the work of outlaws passing through. It was a massacre born of vengeance, and it came from someone who knew them. Sheriff James Caldwell was a man of duty. Weathered by age and loss, he had buried a wife and son before ever wearing the badge. But nothing had prepared him for the sight of the Blackwood farmhouse. He stood over the bodies with his hat pressed to his chest, his jaw tight with grief. He had known the children, watched them grow from infants to spirited youth. He had shared meals at the Blackwood table, listened to Thomas's booming laugh and Eleanor's gentle voice. As the townsfolk demanded answers, Caldwell made a quiet vow. He would uncover the truth, no matter where it led. But in his heart, he already knew what many feared to admit. The storm had erased tracks, but the violence was too precise to be the work of drifters. The killers were not strangers. They were neighbors, hidden among the grieving faces now gathered outside. The investigation began, but Hollow Creek was a place built on secrets. Suspicions spread quickly. Some pointed to Elias Turner, a farmer who had lost land to Thomas after a bitter dispute. Others whispered of Silas Boone, a drifter seen quarreling with Thomas at the tavern. Even Reverend Hollingsworth, who had publicly clashed with Thomas about donations, was not free from rumor. Caldwell tried to separate truth from gossip, but the deeper he looked, the more tangled the web became. Resentment ran through Hollow Creek like a hidden river. Almost every family, it seemed, had a grievance with the Blackwoods. But grievance did not equal murder, or did it? At the funeral, 5 coffins lined the chapel aisle. The entire town gathered, their heads bowed in mourning. Yet Caldwell, standing at the back, scanned their faces. He knew at least one of them was not mourning. One of them was hiding blood on their hands. Amid the ruin of the farmhouse, Caldwell searched for answers. In a drawer beneath Eleanor's sewing kit, he discovered a worn leather diary. Its pages held ordinary entries, lists of chores, notes about the children, hymns she loved. But the final pages chilled him. Strange noises in the night, shadows in the trees. Thomas dismisses my fears, but I feel we are being watched. Another entry read, "Our family's sins weigh heavy. What was taken from others may one day be taken from us. I fear it is soon." Caldwell closed the book slowly. What sins had Eleanor meant? Was she speaking of land disputes, of debts and grudges that Thomas had left unresolved? Or had she sensed something darker, something more imminent? To Caldwell, the diary was not just a record. It was a warning, one the family had not heeded. Caldwell dug into old records and stories buried in memory. Piece by piece, a troubling picture emerged. Years earlier, Thomas Blackwood had acquired land that once belonged to smaller farmers. Some sold willingly, others claimed they were pressured. One family in particular, the Harrisons, lost everything when Thomas bought their debt from a bank. They moved away in shame, but whispers remained that they had vowed revenge. The sheriff also uncovered quarrels still fresh. Fields bordering the Blackwood estate had been in dispute for years, with accusations of stolen crops and water rights. Caldwell realized the Blackwoods' fortune was not just a blessing, it was a lightning rod, drawing envy and bitterness. The massacre, then, was not a random act. It was the explosion of years of anger and resentment. The Blackwoods had built their home on land that carried both wealth and curses, and now that curse had come due. A week after the massacre, a boy named Samuel came forward. Only 10 years old, his wide eyes reflected both fear and confusion. He claimed he had been playing near the edge of the woods when he saw lanterns moving near the Blackwood farmhouse. The shapes were human, he insisted, moving in strange, coordinated patterns. "Who were they?" Caldwell asked gently. Samuel swallowed hard. They weren't strangers," he whispered. "They were people from town. I know some of them." The sheriff leaned closer. "Do you remember their names?" The boy shook violently. "If I say, they'll come for me." Caldwell's stomach sank. The truth was there, dangling like a knife over Hollow Creek. The killers weren't wandering outlaws. They were neighbors, friends, even trusted acquaintances. And the boy's terror reminded Caldwell of a harsh reality. Fear and silence were as deadly as bullets. Despite Samuel's warning, the town's powerful families united to protect their own. Pressure on Caldwell was immense. Some suggested letting the matter rest quietly. Others whispered that the town could never survive a scandal exposing its own sons and fathers. Caldwell knew the evidence pointed to locals, but the law could not touch them without witnesses willing to testify. Hollow Creek's grief turned into guilt, and guilt into collective silence. The sheriff's badge felt heavier each day. The Blackwood family deserved justice, but justice was denied. Even as time passed, Caldwell would occasionally stand near the burned farmhouse, staring at the empty fields where the Blackwoods once thrived. The silence of the town was deafening, a reminder that moral courage had been buried alongside the victims. As years went by, Hollow Creek learned to live with its tragedy. But the story of the Blackwoods never faded entirely. Children dared one another to approach the ruined farmhouse. Some claimed to hear Eleanor's soft sobs drifting from the broken windows. Others swore they saw flickering candlelight dancing in the night. Farmers spoke of plows mysteriously breaking when tilled near the Blackwood property. Dogs refused to cross the fields, and the wind seemed to whisper old grievances. Hollow Creek called it a curse, though many believed it was the weight of guilt manifesting in strange ways. Even skeptics admitted something lingered there, a memory, a shadow, a warning. The town could rebuild, but it could never forget. The Blackwoods' absence had left more than grief. It left a moral echo that haunted every corner. By the turn of the century, the story of the Blackwoods faded into whispers. New families moved in, and new tragedies filled the gaps in memory. Yet, for those who remembered, the massacre remained vivid. Caldwell, now elderly and weary, still walked the neglected graves, muttering to himself. "I failed you," he whispered one autumn evening. "I failed to give you peace." To the town, his mutterings were the ramblings of an old man. But for Caldwell, each word carried the weight of decades, a reminder that silence could protect the guilty while condemning the innocent. Hollow Creek had moved forward, but the ghosts of 1882 lingered, reminding those who dared to remember that some wrongs could never truly be erased. Nearly 40 years after the tragedy, Clara Winslow arrived in Hollow Creek. A young historian with an obsession for forgotten stories, she sought to uncover the truth behind the Blackwood Massacre. The town initially resisted her, warning her that some histories were better left buried. But Clara's determination, combined with her empathy, won over a few elderly residents. They shared fragments of memory, details about the night, faces glimpsed in shadow, rumors too long unspoken. Through these fragments, Clara began to reconstruct a picture of what had happened. She sensed that the story was not merely one of murder, but of human flaws, pride, envy, and fear that escalated into unspeakable violence. And she was determined to tell it, no matter how uncomfortable it made the town. Clara eventually met Sheriff Caldwell, now frail and close to death. His hands trembled as he handed her Eleanor's diary, and his voice cracked with emotion. "The town knew," he admitted. "We all knew, but admitting it would have torn Hollow Creek apart. So we stayed silent. That silence. It killed me too." Caldwell begged Clara to tell the story honestly, to give the Blackwoods the voice they had been denied for decades. For the first time, he seemed lighter, as if passing the burden of truth to another could finally grant him peace. Clara promised she would, vowing to honor both the victims and the town's complex, painful history. Through meticulous research, Clara pieced together the conspiracy. It was not a single killer, but a group of townsfolk, ordinary people driven by envy, anger, and the desire to reclaim perceived injustices. These men, trusted neighbors of the Blackwoods, had planned and executed the massacre with chilling precision. Their descendants still lived in Hollow Creek, carrying shame unspoken but deeply felt. Clara's heart ached as she realized how easily fear and pride can twist ordinary people into perpetrators. The massacre had been a community crime, hidden behind polite smiles and whispered prayers for decades. Clara reflected on the deeper lesson. The Blackwood tragedy was not only about murder, it was about silence. Hollow Creek had turned away from truth, letting fear and envy dictate behavior. By failing to confront wrongdoing, the town had allowed injustice to flourish unchecked. It was a story of human weakness, but also a reminder that awareness and courage can break cycles of suffering. The Blackwoods' death had been the result of grudges held too tightly and silence maintained too long. Clara realized that remembering, telling the truth, and forgiving were powerful acts capable of reversing even the deepest moral failings. While examining letters and forgotten documents, Clara uncovered one last piece, a letter from Eleanor never sent. In it, Eleanor apologized to the Harrison family, whose land had been taken years earlier, for the wrongs caused by her husband. She offered assistance and reconciliation, hoping to mend old wounds. Had it been delivered, the massacre might have been prevented. Anger could have been softened by empathy. Grudges could have been ended by understanding. The tragedy was not only a lesson in human cruelty, it was also a reminder that acts of kindness, even delayed, can avert unimaginable consequences. Clara published her account, The Blackwood Family Murders of 1882, A Forgotten Massacre. It was a story of greed, envy, silence, and the consequences of unresolved bitterness, but also a story of hope. Readers far beyond Hollow Creek reflected on their own lives, realizing the danger of letting grudges fester. Eleanor's final words from her diary closed Clara's book. "It is never too late to forgive. But if forgiveness is buried, so too are we." The Blackwoods' tragedy became timeless. Their loss taught communities that silence and envy destroy, but truth, courage, and empathy endure. Though Hollow Creek had tried to forget, the story lived on, not as a tale of horror, but as a lesson of reflection, moral courage, and the enduring power of forgiveness.